Hello, and welcome back to another evening together. I'm glad you're here, whatever hour it happens to be on your end. Get yourself comfortable, dim whatever needs dimming, and let's spend a little while in the company of a show I think about far more than is probably healthy. Tonight we're going to talk about the villains of Dexter, all of them more or less, but not in the way you might expect. We're not here to rank them from worst to best, and we're not here to count down to some big dramatic reveal of the single most evil person in the show. That's not really what tonight's about. What I want to do instead is sort of wander through the whole gallery of them, the killers and the schemers and the monsters and the ones who don't quite fit any of those words, and talk about the different kinds of evil the show kept handing us over the years. Because here's the thing I've always found interesting about Dexter, and it's the idea that's going to hold this whole evening together. The show never treated evil as one single thing, it treated it as a spectrum, a ladder almost. There's the small, grubby, pathetic kind of evil at the bottom, the sort that barely needs explaining. And then it climbs, level by level, all the way up to something far stranger and far more personal. By the time you reach the top of that ladder, the people standing there aren't strangers Dexter hunts in the dark. They're family, they share his blood, or they helped build the man he became. So I've split it into 7 levels. I'll be honest with you, the number 7 isn't handed down from on high or anything. It's just the way the pieces seemed to fall when I sat down and started grouping them by how they're evil rather than when they showed up. Level 1 is the everyday stuff. Level 7 is blood of his blood. And in between, we'll meet manipulators, mobsters, true believers, and the family men who hid their monstrousness inside the most ordinary lives imaginable. A quick word on how this works, since it's a sleep video and I don't want you straining to keep up. Each level is its own little self-contained thing. You don't have to stay awake for the whole climb to get anything out of it. If you drift off somewhere around the Ukrainian mob, you won't have missed some crucial payoff waiting at the end. There isn't a payoff waiting at the end. There's just more good company and more interesting people to talk about. So there's genuinely no pressure to make it to the finish line tonight. The finish line will still be here tomorrow. If you enjoy these long-form rambles through shows we love, subscribing does help the channel keep going, and I'd appreciate it. But that's the only time I'll mention it for a good while, so let's not dwell. There's one thread I want to gently lay down before we start, because it's going to keep surfacing as we climb. Every single villain on this list is in some quiet way a mirror held up to Dexter himself. The show was obsessed with this. Almost every season, it found a new way to show Dexter a version of what he could become, or what he already was, or what he was desperately pretending not to be. So as we move through these 7 levels, keep half an eye on that. We're not just cataloging bad people. We're watching a man stare into a series of mirrors and flinch at what he sees, or more unsettlingly, not flinch at all. And one more small thing about the spirit of tonight, since we're going to be spending it in some genuinely dark company. I don't approach any of these characters with contempt, and I gently encourage you not to either, even the worst of them. Not because they deserve sympathy exactly, but because the whole reason this show is worth talking about at 1 in the morning is that it took its monsters seriously as people rather than as cardboard. It wanted to understand them. It believed that the difference between one kind of darkness and another actually mattered. And I think the right way to spend an evening with a show like that is in the same spirit it was made, which is curious rather than judgmental, fond rather than appalled. We're not here to be horrified. We've all seen these episodes. We know what happens. We're here to think about them slowly, in good company, the way you turn an interesting object over in your hands long after you've stopped being surprised by it. That's the mood I'm going for. Settle into it with me. Right, that's enough preamble. Let's start at the bottom of the ladder where the evil is the smallest and the saddest, and work our way up from there. So this is the ground floor, the bottom rung of the ladder. The kind of evil that needs no grand theory behind it, no manifesto, no childhood mythology. It's just people being cruel because they're weak or selfish or both. And I think it's the right place to start because everything that comes later only feels as dark as it does by comparison. You have to know what small evil looks like before the big stuff means anything. Let's begin with Paul Bennett because he's the perfect example of this tier and because the show is smart about how it uses him. Paul is Rita's ex-husband, the father of Aster and Cody, and he is, by any honest measure, a wreck of a man, a drug addict, an abuser, the kind of person whose presence in a house makes everyone in it smaller and more frightened. When we meet Rita in the early going, she flinches at being touched. She's jumpy, guarded, braced for impact in a way that takes a while to fully understand. And then you meet Paul, and it all clicks into place. This is what he did to her. This is the shape a person gets bent into when they live with someone like that. What I appreciate about how the show handles Paul is that it never makes him interesting in a flattering way. He's not a charming rogue. He's not secretly brilliant. He's just a damaged, dangerous man who hurt the people who were supposed to be able to trust him. And the damage doesn't stop with Rita. It ripples outward into the kids, into Aster especially, who carries a wariness that no child should have to carry. That's the thing about this lowest level of evil. It's not spectacular, it doesn't make headlines. It happens in living rooms and bedrooms, and it leaves marks you can't always see. Sort of like how the most lasting damage in real life rarely comes from the dramatic villains. It comes from the ordinary ones, the people who are just close enough to do real harm. Now, Dexter being Dexter, he eventually deals with Paul, though not in the clean way the code would prefer. There's a whole messy business with a shoe and a frame up, and Paul ending up in prison and then dead, and Dexter's hands aren't entirely clean in how it shakes out. But the relevant thing for tonight is what Paul represents. He's the kind of person the world is quietly better off without, and the show knows we feel that. And it lets us feel it without too much hand-wringing. That's a luxury it won't extend to us much higher up the ladder. And speaking of people the world is better off without, let me talk about the whole category that Paul belongs to, because level 1 is really less about any single person and more about a type. These are the table victims, the disposable monsters. The men, and they are almost always men, who populate Dexter's kill room in the early seasons, and exist mostly to remind us what the code was built for. Think back to the very first episode. The very first kill we ever watched Dexter perform is a man named Mike Donovan, a choir director who has been murdering young boys. It's a brutal opening, and it's meant to be, because the show is making a deal with you right there in the first 10 minutes. It's saying, look, this man does this for a living, but watch who he does it to. And Donovan is exactly the sort of person designed to make you, the viewer, lean back and think, well, all right then, he's a child killer. The show puts him on the table specifically so that your first taste of Dexter's darkness goes down easy. That's the trick of level 1, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The show stocks the early seasons with these uncomplicated villains, the pedophiles and the child murderers, and the people who prey on the genuinely helpless, precisely because they let us root for a serial killer without feeling too bad about it. There's a drunk driver in the first season, a man who killed a child while behind the wheel and walked away from it with barely a scratch on his conscience. There are men who hunt women. There are people who hurt kids. And more often than not, Dexter wraps them in plastic and asks them to look at photographs of what they've done before he ends them. Here's a fun detail I always come back to. The early kills are almost ritualistic in how clearly they're sorted into good targets and bad targets. And the show is doing this on purpose. It's training us. It's getting us comfortable. And the ritual itself is worth describing because it's the same one every single time at this level, and the repetition is doing quiet work on us. Dexter takes his target to a private room he's prepared, wraps the space in plastic so nothing escapes it, secures the person to a table, and then crucially shows them photographs, pictures of the people they hurt. He makes them look. He makes them acknowledge what they did before he ends it. And the show wants us to understand that this is not, in Dexter's mind, simple murder. It's something closer to a verdict being read and a sentence being carried out. The photographs are the evidence, the table is the courtroom, He's appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, and the ritual exists to convince him and us that what's happening is justice rather than slaughter. At level 1, the ritual works on us beautifully because the targets are so plainly guilty that the show's appointment of itself as judge feels almost reasonable. We've seen what Mike Donovan did, we've seen the drunk driver walk free, so when Dexter holds up the photographs and reads the verdict, some part of us nods along. Yes, that's right, that one had it coming. But notice what's being smuggled in under that nodding. We're being asked to accept that one man operating in secret gets to decide who deserves to die. And we're being asked to accept it because in these particular cases, we happen to agree with his judgment. The trouble, of course, is that a system that depends entirely on us agreeing with the judge's taste is no system at all. It's just one man's preferences wearing the costume of justice. And the higher we climb tonight, the more that costume slips. Because the trick of stalking the bottom rung with such obvious monsters is precisely to get us to grant Dexter that authority before we've thought too hard about it. By the time the show starts handing him harder cases, the ones where the guilt is murkier or the victim is someone we might have liked, we've already signed off on the basic premise. We've already agreed that Dexter gets to decide. That's the deal the bottom of the ladder quietly closes with us. And we close it gladly because at this level it costs us nothing. It only starts costing us later. But that's the genius of starting here. With the easy ones, you don't notice the price of a thing when the first few are given away for free. The show knows that later on it's going to start blurring those lines until we can't tell anymore whether Dexter is a hero with a dark hobby or a monster with a good publicist. But at level 1, before any of that blurring starts, the moral math is simple. These people did terrible things. Dexter ends them. We're meant to feel something close to relief. I think there's something almost gentle, in a strange way, about how the show treats this tier. It never asks us to feel sorry for the level 1 villains. It never gives them long monologues or tragic backstories. They get exactly as much screen time as they need to establish what they did, and then they're gone. Compare that to how much time we'll spend later with Trinity, or with Brian, or with Hannah, where the show practically begs us to understand them. At the bottom of the ladder, understanding isn't the point. These are simply people who chose cruelty, and the show lets that be the whole story. One thing that fascinates me, though, is how this lowest level quietly sets the rules that every higher level will break. The code, as Harry built it, is essentially a level 1 instrument. It was designed to point Dexter at exactly these people. The ones who hurt the innocent, the ones who've gotten away with something monstrous, the ones nobody will miss. It's a tidy little system, and at this level, it works beautifully. The trouble, and we'll get to this as the evening goes on, is that evil rarely stays this tidy. The higher we climb, the more the people we meet refuse to fit into Harry's neat little box. They have charm, they have philosophy, they have families. Some of them have a claim on Dexter that no code could ever account for, but that's all to come. For now, just settle into the simple version. Down here at the bottom, there are bad people doing bad things, and a man in a green apron who makes them disappear. No deeper meaning required. Sometimes evil really is just small and sad and pathetic, and there's an odd kind of comfort in a show that's willing to start there before it complicates everything. Let me dwell on one more figure from this tier because I think he illustrates something about the show's conscience that's easy to walk past. There's a man in the first season, a drunk driver, who killed a child while behind the wheel and faced almost nothing for it. No real consequence, no genuine reckoning, just the machinery of the justice system shrugging and moving on. And this is the kind of case that drives Dexter, and frankly the kind that the show uses to test our own instincts. Because here's a man who, by any ordinary measure, isn't a serial killer or a monster in the Gothic sense. He made a catastrophic, selfish choice, and a teenager died, and he walked. So what do we do with him? The law has already decided, and the show puts that question right in front of us, almost daring us to feel that the law got it wrong, that something more is owed here. I find that genuinely interesting because it's the first sign of the show stretching the boundaries of its own bottom tier. The choir director and the child hunters are easy. Nobody loses sleep over those. But the drunk driver is a slightly harder case, a person whose evil is more about consequence than intent. And the fact that he still ends up qualifying for Dexter's attention tells you the code was always a little more elastic than Harry liked to pretend. It's worth holding on to because that elasticity is going to matter enormously the higher we climb. The line between deserving and undeserving, which feels so crisp down here at the bottom, gets blurrier with every rung. There's a broader observation worth making about how the show paces all of this. The level 1 villains tend to arrive and depart within a single episode, sometimes within a single act. They're the procedural texture, the cases of the week that fill the space around the bigger season-long arcs. And that disposability is the point. The show is quietly teaching us a hierarchy of attention. The more screen time a killer gets, the more we're meant to wrestle with them. The men who get a few minutes before the plastic wrap closes over them are the ones we're allowed to dismiss. It's a kind of moral shorthand, and it works on us whether we notice it or not. By the time we reach the killers, the show genuinely wants us to sit with. We've already been trained to understand that the brief ones don't count for much, which is, when you think about it, a slightly chilling thing for a piece of television to have taught us so smoothly. I'll say one last thing about the bottom of the ladder before we move up, and it's almost a fondness. There's a cleanness to level 1 that the show never gets back. Once you leave it, the moral water gets muddier and stays muddy for good. So in a strange way, these early, simple, pathetic villains are the last time the show ever let us feel uncomplicated about anything. After this, every monster comes with a complication attached, a reason to pause, a mirror angled back toward Dexter himself. The bottom rung is the only place you get to stand and feel certain. Enjoy it while it lasts, which brings us gently to the next rung up. Because the moment evil stops being purely physical and starts becoming clever, the whole picture changes. Let's talk about the manipulators. Now we step up a rung and the nature of the evil changes. At level 1, the danger was mostly physical. Someone hurt someone else with their hands. Up here, the weapon is different. Up here, the weapon is charm, or persuasion, or the ability to look you dead in the eye and make you believe something that simply isn't true. These are the opportunists and the manipulators, the people who get what they want by working on other people's minds rather than their bodies. And I find this tier genuinely unsettling in a way level 1 never was, because you can lock a door against a man with a knife. It's much harder to lock a door against someone who's already talked their way inside your head. The defining figure here, for me, has to be Lila. Leela West, or Lila Tournay, depending on which alias you're going by, who arrives in the second season and proceeds to make a wonderful, terrible mess of Dexter's life. On paper, Lila is Dexter's sponsor. He's pretending to be a recovering addict at this point, a cover story he's using to explain his suspicious behavior to Rita. And Lila is the woman assigned to help him through his supposed recovery. In practice, Lila is something far more dangerous. She's an arsonist, she's an obsessive, she's a person with absolutely no functioning brakes, who decides she's found a kindred spirit in Dexter and will burn down anything and anyone standing between them. And I do mean burn down, literally. The thing about Lila is that her evil isn't premeditated in the cold, careful way we'll see further up the ladder. It's reactive, it's emotional. She wants something, she's denied it, and she lashes out with fire. She torches a cabin with people inside. She poses a real threat to Rita and the children. By the end of her run, she's become one of the most genuinely chaotic forces the show ever introduced, precisely because you can't predict her, a planner you can anticipate. Lila, you cannot, because even she doesn't seem to know what she's going to do until she's doing it. What makes her a level 2 villain rather than something higher is that there's no real architecture to her. No philosophy, no grand design, no code of her own. She's pure want. She sees Dexter, decides he belongs to her, And everything after that is just the increasingly destructive lengths she'll go to in order to make that true. It's evil as appetite. And honestly, I think the show found her a little hard to control as a character, which is sort of fitting, given that being hard to control was her entire personality. There's a detail about Lila that I think is easy to miss, and it's how thoroughly she gets under Dexter's skin. Not romantically, though there's that too. What rattles him is that she seems to genuinely see something in him. She talks about his emptiness, his sense of being a monster, his feeling of being fundamentally separate from other people. And she does it like she recognizes it, like she's got a version of it herself. And for a man who has spent his entire life believing he's uniquely broken, having someone look at you and say, "I know exactly what you are and I want it," that's a profoundly destabilizing thing. We'll come back to this idea a lot tonight, this business of Dexter being unsettled not by people who hate him, but by people who understand him. Lila is the first real taste of it. Let me pivot to a very different kind of manipulator, because level 2 isn't only about seductive chaos agents. It's also home to the people who manipulate out of pure obsessive self-interest. And the standout there is Stan Liddy. Now, Liddy is a former cop, brought back into Dexter's orbit in the 5th season, and his whole deal is dogged, grinding obsession. He becomes convinced that Dexter is hiding something, and he simply will not let it go. He surveils him, he digs, he bugs and watches and waits, willing to throw away every rule and every shred of his own dignity for the chance to be the one who finally nails Dexter Morgan. Liddy isn't evil in the grand sense. He's not killing innocents. But he belongs on this tier because his method is manipulation and his motive is entirely self-serving. He wants the win. He wants to be proven right, and he's willing to operate completely outside the law to get there, which puts him in this strange gray zone where he's technically chasing a genuine monster, but he's doing it for all the wrong reasons and in all the wrong ways. There's no justice in Liddy. There's just ego dressed up as persistence. And it gets him exactly where that kind of thing tends to get people in this show. I want to take a small detour here because there's a category of evil at this level that the show treats almost as a running joke, and I'd feel remiss not to mention it with the affection it deserves. I'm talking about the evil of sheer institutional incompetence, specifically Miami Metro Homicide, which I have said before and will happily say again, might just be the least effective investigative unit in the entire history of fictional law enforcement. Now, I say this with love, genuine love, but think about it for a second. Dexter works inside this police department for years. He is a serial killer with a body count that would make most real-world murderers look like amateurs. And he does his day job surrounded by detectives whose entire profession is noticing when something is wrong. And they notice nothing. For seasons on end, the man casually disposing of bodies all over the city is the cheerful blood spatter guy who brings donuts to the office. It's absurd. It's gloriously, lovingly absurd, and the show mostly gets away with it because we want Dexter to stay free. So we conveniently forget to ask why nobody around him can do basic arithmetic about his whereabouts. I don't think the show's incompetence is evil, obviously. It's narrative convenience wearing a badge. But there's a gentle thematic point hiding in it, which is that real evil often hides not behind genius, but behind ordinariness and inattention. Dexter doesn't evade capture because he's a criminal mastermind. He evades it because the people around him aren't really looking, and because he's careful to be exactly as boring as everyone expects. That's worth holding on to as we climb, because the most dangerous villains we'll meet tonight all share that exact quality. They hide in plain sight behind a face nobody thinks to question. There's a particular quality to Lila that I think is worth dwelling on because the show uses her to expose something about Dexter's appetites that he'd really rather not examine. Dexter is drawn to her even as he recognizes how dangerous she is. He keeps going back. And the reason, I think, is that Lila offers him a version of intimacy that doesn't require the exhausting performance he keeps up everywhere else, With Rita, he's playing a part every single second, monitoring his own behavior, simulating the responses a normal man would have. With Lila, there's a horrible relief because she doesn't want the normal man. She wants the empty one. And for someone who's tired, bone tired of the performance, that relief is a drug all its own. The fact that she's an arsonist almost becomes a secondary detail next to the simple seduction of not having to pretend. That's the danger of the manipulator at this level. They don't break in by force. They find the lock that's already loose and let themselves in, and the cost of letting her in is steep because Lila does not stay contained. Once she's decided that Dexter is hers, the people Dexter actually cares about become obstacles in her eyes, and obstacles are things to be removed. The threat she eventually poses to Rita and the children is the moment the show stops letting us enjoy her chaos and forces us to see it for what it is. She's not a misunderstood kindred spirit, she's a fire that will consume anything in reach, and Dexter let her get close to the only warmth in his life. The lesson, if there is one, is that the manipulators are most dangerous precisely when you've started to enjoy their company. The charm is the bait. Now, what fascinates me about Liddy as a counterpoint to Lila is that he's the manipulator with no charm whatsoever. None. Where Layla seduces, Liddy simply grinds. He's all surveillance and patience and grubby determination, a man who's decided that being right about Dexter is the last thing he has left, and he'll burn his whole life down for the chance to prove it. There's something almost pitiable about him if you squint. He's not entirely wrong after all. He's the rare character who's actually correct that Dexter is hiding something monstrous. But being right for the wrong reasons and going about it in the wrong way doesn't earn you anything in this show. Liddy isn't pursuing justice. He's pursuing vindication, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a hero and a man who ends up exactly where Liddy ends up. I think the show is making a quiet point with Liddy that connects to something it returns to again and again. The people who get closest to catching Dexter are almost never the ones following clean forensic trails. They're the ones who feel something and then let that feeling curdle into obsession. Liddy felt that something was wrong with Dexter long before he could prove it, and instead of building a careful case, he let the feeling consume him. We'll see this pattern repeat in much more sympathetic figures later, the ones who sense the truth in their gut. Liddy is the ugly version of that instinct, the same intuition turned rancid through ego. He's what happens when the gut feeling isn't tempered by any decency about how you act on it. As for Miami Metro, I'll just add one more loving jab before I let it go because it genuinely delights me. The department doesn't merely fail to catch the killer in their midst. It repeatedly promotes him, praises him, relies on his expertise to solve the very crimes he's adjacent to, and at one truly remarkable point finds itself investigating cases that he is directly responsible for, with him standing right there in the room offering his professional analysis of the blood. It's the kind of thing that should collapse under the slightest scrutiny, and the show simply asks us with a straight face to let it slide, and we do. Every time. Because the alternative is Dexter getting caught, and we don't want that, so we collectively agree not to think about it too hard. It's one of the great unspoken contracts between this show and its audience, and I find it more charming than maddening. A show has to earn that kind of forgiveness, and Dexter mostly did, so that's level 2. The charmers, the obsessives, the manipulators, the people whose weapon is the human mind rather than the human body. What unites them is that none of them have a real system. They want things and they bend other people to get those things, but there's no larger machinery behind them. They're freelancers, essentially, operating alone, driven by appetite or ego, which is precisely what changes at the next level. Because the moment evil stops being a solo act and starts becoming a business, with structure and loyalty and rules of its own, you're dealing with something else entirely. Let's talk about the mob. Here's where evil gets organized. Up to now, we've been dealing with individuals, people acting alone out of their own private damage or hunger. At level 3, the violence comes with infrastructure behind it. There are bosses and soldiers and money and territory. Killing isn't a compulsion at this level, and it isn't really even personal. It's transactional. It's a cost of doing business. And I find this tier fascinating precisely because the people on it are often the most rational villains in the entire show. They're not driven by some unbottleable inner darkness. They're driven by profit and loyalty, which makes them, in a strange way, the most relatable monsters Dexter ever crossed. And I want to lead with a man who, for my money, is one of the best characters the show ever produced. Full stop. Isaac Sirko. Isaac arrives in the 7th season as the head of the Koshka Brotherhood, a Ukrainian organized crime outfit. And on paper, he should be a straightforward antagonist. He's a mob boss. He's powerful, controlled, lethal. He comes to Miami with a clear purpose, and that purpose is to find out who killed one of his men and make them pay. The man who was killed is named Victor, and the man who killed Victor is, of course, Dexter. But here's what the show does, and it's the reason Isaac stands so far above most of the villains around him. It refuses to let him be just a mob boss. The more time we spend with Isaac, the more we realize that his pursuit of Dexter isn't about business at all. Victor wasn't just an employee. The grief Isaac carries is the grief of someone who has lost a person he loved. And the longer the season runs, the clearer it becomes that the relationship between Isaac and Victor ran far deeper than the surface of a crime boss and his soldier. Isaac is mourning. And his hunt for Dexter, which begins as something that looks like vengeance dressed in corporate clothing, slowly reveals itself as something much closer to heartbreak. There's a scene I think about a lot where Isaac sits and tells Dexter a story about his grandfather. It's a story about patience and about waiting years and years for the right moment to settle a debt of blood. A party official had wronged his family back in the old country, had a relative hanged, had his grandfather sent away to Siberia. And his grandfather waited through the whole arc of his life until the Soviet Union finally fell, and then found that fat little official in a crowd and quietly settled the account with a knife. It's a story about how some grievances don't fade, they just bide their time. And Isaac tells it to Dexter as a kind of warning. This is over when I say it's over, he's saying. I'm a patient man. And Dexter, in one of his better moments, looks at him and says, there's only one problem. I'm not some fat little man. And Isaac laughs because he genuinely doesn't know who Dexter is yet. And Dexter tells him that if he ever finds out, he'll regret it. It's a wonderful exchange. Two predators circling each other, each one slowly realizing the other isn't quite what they assumed. What I love about it is that there's no hatred in it. There's almost a respect, a recognition. Because here's where Isaac becomes something rare in this show. He and Dexter end up, however briefly, as something close to friends. Circumstances force them together against a common threat, a pair of hitmen sent to deal with Isaac by the very brotherhood he leads. And in the course of that uneasy alliance, the two men actually come to understand one another. Isaac asks Dexter at one point why he kills, and Dexter doesn't answer the way he answers anyone else. There's a strange honesty between them. Two men who live outside the normal moral universe, who've each made peace with the killing in their own way, finding in each other the one person who won't judge them for it. I think Isaac is the show's clearest argument that a villain can be more compelling than a hero. Because by the end of his arc, you don't want anything bad to happen to him. You've forgotten almost that he came to Miami to kill the man we're rooting for. He's become a person, a grieving, dignified, lethal person, yes, but a person with a capacity for loyalty and love that puts most of the so-called good guys to shame. And the show is doing something quietly clever with him. It's showing us that organized evil, the mob, the machine, can house a more coherent moral code than anything else on offer. Isaac's loyalty to Victor is, in its own way, more pure than half the relationships among the heroes. I've always found it a little telling and a little funny in a dark way that one of the most emotionally honest relationships in the entire show is the one between a serial killer and a mob boss who came to town to murder him. There's something almost romantic in the old sense about how Isaac and Dexter end up regarding each other. Two men who've seen the worst of themselves and found in the other somebody who won't pretend to be shocked. They can be honest with each other precisely because neither of them has any moral high ground to defend. It's a strange, bleak kind of friendship, but it's a real one. And it stands out all the more against a cast of characters who spend most of their time lying to each other and to themselves. The mob boss is the one person Dexter doesn't have to perform for. That tells you something about Dexter's world, and none of it flattering. And I think that's the quiet brilliance of where the show places its organized crime villains. It would have been easy to make the mob purely menacing, a faceless threat with guns. Instead, the show used Isaac to suggest that a man operating entirely outside the law, in a world of debts and vengeance and blood, might nonetheless live by a more consistent set of principles than the people with badges. Isaac says what he means. He keeps his word, he grieves honestly, he kills for reasons he can articulate, and then stops when the reasons are satisfied. How many of the heroes can say as much? It's not that the show is endorsing the mob. It's that it's using the mob to hold up yet another mirror. This one asking whether the difference between a criminal and a citizen is really about morality at all, or just about which side of the law you happen to land on. Now, level 3 isn't only Isaac, even if he towers over it. The mob and the machine show up in other forms across the series. There's the Colombian element that swirls around the 7th season, the cartel figures who threaten Isaac in prison and who treat killing as simple arithmetic. So-and-so killed 3 of ours, therefore we kill him, nothing personal. That's the texture of this level. Violence as bookkeeping. And then, going back a few seasons, there's George King, the man they called the Skinner, from the 3rd season. King is a different flavor of the machine entirely. He's an interrogator, essentially a man with a background in extracting information through torture. And his method is exactly as grim as the nickname suggests. He skins his victims alive to make them talk. What lands him on this organized evil tier rather than somewhere darker is that his cruelty is in service of an end. He's looking for someone, working a problem, and the horror is a tool rather than the point. He's a professional in the worst possible sense of that word. The torture is the job. There's a moment in the prison yard during the stretch when Isaac is locked up that I think captures his whole essence in a few seconds. He's sitting alone at a picnic table when a cartel man comes over to threaten him, all swagger and menace, telling Isaac that his people are coming for him because of bodies Isaac supposedly owes them. And Isaac doesn't flinch, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't bluster. He simply reaches out, takes the man's wrist, and twists it until something breaks. Calm the entire time. It's not rage, it's not even particularly personal. It's a man who has decided that a problem needs solving and has solved it with the minimum of fuss. That's the machine at its most refined. Violence as a tool, applied precisely without heat. And yet the very next beats with Isaac undercut that coldness completely, which is the magic of the character. The same man who breaks a wrist without blinking is the man carrying around a grief so heavy it's reorganized his entire life around it. The show keeps doing this with him, showing us the lethal professional and then quietly pulling back the curtain on the heartbroken man underneath until you genuinely can't hold the two images apart anymore. He becomes whole in a way that very few villains ever do. Most antagonists are one thing. Isaac is several things at once, and they don't resolve into a tidy summary, which is exactly what makes him feel like a person rather than a plot function. I think the reason the writers could get away with making him so sympathetic is that he's never a threat to the people we love most. His quarrel is with Dexter, and even that quarrel softens into something like mutual regard. He never threatens Deb in any meaningful way, never goes after Harrison, never poisons the wells that the family men and the blood relatives will poison further up the ladder. His evil, such as it is, stays inside its own world, The world of the Brotherhood and its codes and its debts, it's contained. And containment, it turns out, is what lets us afford to like him. We can enjoy Isaac precisely because his darkness is pointed away from the things we're protective of. That's a luxury the show will withdraw entirely by the time we reach the top. I want to give George King a little more room too, because the Skinner is a useful contrast that throws Isaac into relief. Where Isaac is all restraint and dignity, King is the machine stripped of any humanizing grace. He's pure method. The horror he inflicts is in service of extracting information, and he's good at it in the way a craftsman is good at a trade, which is the genuinely sickening part. There's no pleasure in it that the show lets us see, and no real ideology behind it either. He's looking for something, working a problem, and the people he tortures are simply the means. It's evil as labor. And I think the reason King never rises above this tier in the show's imagination, never becomes a Trinity or a Brian, is precisely that there's nothing underneath the method. No tragedy, no mirror, no claim on Dexter. He's a function with a knife. Frightening, certainly, but not haunting. The machine without the man. That contrast, King against Isaac, is really the whole story of Level 3 in miniature. Organized, transactional evil can house a man with more loyalty and love in him than half the heroes. Or it can house a man who is nothing but his function. Same tier, opposite poles. What they share is the absence of compulsion, the thing that separates everyone down here from the killers who are about to arrive. None of them have to kill. They choose to, for reasons that make a cold kind of sense. And that, strange as it sounds, is what makes them the last fundamentally rational creatures we'll meet tonight. What unites everyone on this level, from Isaac at the top to the faceless cartel soldiers at the bottom, is that detachment, the lack of personal compulsion. None of these people kill because they need to, the way the killers higher up the ladder need to. They kill because it serves a purpose, settles a debt, protects an interest. And there's a cold logic to that which I find oddly less frightening than what's coming. A man who kills for a reason can, in theory, be reasoned with. You can pay him off, or outweight him, or give him what he wants. Isaac even keeps his word in the end. He says that once the hitmen are dealt with, he'll leave Dexter alone, and he means it. There's an honor to it. That honor is exactly what evaporates as we climb higher. Because the next level isn't about people who kill for reasons. It's about people who looked at Dexter, saw what he was, and wanted to make him part of it. Not enemies, partners. And that, as we're about to see, is a far more dangerous proposition than any mob boss with a grudge. So let me pour us both a fresh metaphorical cup of something, and let's talk about the people who tried to get close to Dexter. Really close. This is the level where the evil gets intimate. Not in a physical sense, necessarily, but in the sense that the people here aren't trying to kill Dexter or expose Dexter or use Dexter. They're trying to join him, to be let in, to stand beside him in that private space he's spent his whole life keeping locked. And I think this is where the show starts asking its most uncomfortable questions. Because to be seduced into partnership, you have to be tempted. And to be tempted, some part of you has to want it. So every villain on this level is really a story about a door inside Dexter and whether or not he'll open it. Let's start with Miguel Prado because his is the cleanest version of this story and in some ways the saddest. Miguel arrives in the third season as an assistant district attorney, a charismatic, ambitious, well-connected man, and through a chain of events that begins with Dexter accidentally killing Miguel's brother, the two of them fall into an unlikely friendship. It's worth pausing on how strange and accidental the whole thing is because the show seems to delight in the awful irony of it. Dexter kills a man in self-defense during what was supposed to be a routine night, and that man turns out to be the brother of an ambitious prosecutor. By any ordinary logic, this should make Miguel Dexter's mortal enemy, the grieving relative who'll never rest until he finds out what happened. Instead, through the peculiar alchemy of the show, the death becomes the foundation of a friendship. Miguel, hungry for someone who shares his sense that the justice system is broken and that some people simply need to be dealt with outside it, finds in Dexter a kindred spirit, never suspecting that the man he's bonding with is the very person who took his brother. There's a terrible, dramatic irony humming under every warm moment between them, and the show plays it for all it's worth. A real one by Dexter's standards. Miguel is warm and confident, and he seems to accept Dexter in a way few people do. They become close. They become, and this is the word the show keeps reaching for, friends. Actual friends, which for Dexter is almost unheard of. And then Miguel finds out what Dexter is, and rather than recoiling, he leans in. He wants to learn. He wants to be taught the code, to share in the work, to become a partner in what he sees as a kind of righteous vigilantism. And for a while, Dexter actually lets him. He teaches Miguel. He brings him into the fold. There's a genuine hope on Dexter's part that maybe he's found the thing he never thought possible, which is someone like him, someone he doesn't have to hide from. You can probably guess how it goes. The code in Dexter's hands is a discipline, a set of breaks. In Miguel's hands, it becomes a permission slip. Miguel doesn't want the restraint of the code. He wants the freedom of the killing without the constraint of the rules. And so he starts to drift. He starts choosing targets that suit his own ambitions rather than the code's strict requirements. He starts using the whole apparatus of justified killing to remove people who are merely inconvenient to him. Political rivals, obstacles, people who've done nothing to deserve a place on Dexter's table. And this is the betrayal that cuts Dexter deeper, I'd argue, than almost any physical threat in the series. Because Miguel didn't just turn out to be a bad partner, he turned out to be proof that the dream was a lie. The dream of being understood, of being accepted, of having a true equal who shared his nature. Miguel poisoned all of it. He took the one thing Dexter let himself hope for and revealed it to be just another form of self-interest. When Dexter finally deals with Miguel, there's a real grief underneath it. He isn't just removing a threat, he's burying a friendship in the version of himself that believed the friendship was possible. I've always thought Miguel is one of the most underrated villains in the whole run, precisely because his evil is so human. He's not a monster in the Gothic sense. He's a man who was handed power without limits and discovered he liked it too much. Which is, if you think about it, a far more common kind of evil than any serial killer. It's the evil of the person who decides the rules are for other people. And the show uses him to make Dexter and us confront a deeply uncomfortable thought, which is that the code isn't noble in itself. It's only as good as the person holding it. Give it to the wrong man and it becomes a weapon. Dexter spends a lot of the series telling himself the code makes him better than other killers. Miguel is the season that quietly asks him whether that's true at all. Now let me turn to the most morally tangled figure in the entire show, and someone I genuinely go back and forth on every time I rewatch. Hannah Mukai. I'll be honest, I'm not even certain Hannah belongs on a list about evil at all. And that uncertainty is exactly why she's so interesting. Hannah is a poisoner. She has killed people, more than once, and she's perfectly capable of doing it again without much visible remorse. By any technical definition, she's a murderer, and the show never lets us forget it. And yet she's also the great love of Dexter's later seasons, the one relationship where he seems genuinely dangerously himself. With Rita, he was performing normalcy. With Hannah, there's no performance because Hannah already knows what he is and doesn't need him to pretend otherwise. That's the seduction, you see. It's the same one Miguel offered, but in a far more potent form because Hannah isn't asking to be Dexter's apprentice. She's offering to be his equal, his match, someone who can stand in the full light of his nature without flinching because she's got a version of it herself. And unlike Miguel, who curdled the moment he got a taste of power, Hannah is remarkably stable about who she is. She's not chaotic like Leela. She's not ambitious like Miguel. She has a strange, level-headed peace about her own darkness. She kills when she feels she needs to, and otherwise she tends her flowers and lives her life, and she sleeps just fine, which makes her, in some ways, the most genuinely evil person on this level, and also the most sympathetic, and I don't think those two things cancel out. They coexist. The show is doing something quite sophisticated with Hannah, asking us whether a person who kills but feels no torment about it is worse than a person who kills and suffers for it. Dexter suffers, or at least tells himself he does. Hannah doesn't bother. And there's a part of Dexter that finds that restfulness almost unbearably attractive because it's the peace he's never been able to find. She's what he might be if he ever stopped fighting himself. There's a scene shape that recurs through the Miguel arc that I find quietly heartbreaking on rewatch. It's the two of them just talking, like friends, like men who found each other late in life and can't quite believe their luck. Dexter, who narrates his own loneliness to us constantly, who tells us over and over that he's separate, apart, fundamentally alone, actually relaxes around Miguel for a while. You can see it, the performance eases, and that's what makes the betrayal land the way it does, because we watched him lower the drawbridge, watched him let someone all the way in, and then watched that someone use the access to become exactly the thing the code exists to stop. Miguel didn't just break a rule, he proved that opening the door at all was a mistake. And Dexter, I think, takes that lesson far too thoroughly to heart, which is part of why the loneliness only deepens from there. I think the cruelest part of the Miguel story is what it does to Dexter's understanding of the code itself. Up to this point, Dexter has half believed the code is something almost sacred, a moral structure that makes his killing defensible, maybe even good. And then he hands it to another man and watches it curdle into a tool for petty murder within weeks. The code didn't make Miguel better. It gave him cover. And the unavoidable implication, the one Dexter never quite says out loud, is that maybe the code has only ever been cover for him too. Maybe the rules he's so proud of are just a story he tells himself, the same way Miguel told himself a story. That's a far more destabilizing wound than any physical threat, and the show is wise enough never to let Dexter fully recover from it. With Hannah, I keep circling back to the question of remorse because I think it's the hinge the whole character turns on. We're trained as an audience to grant a kind of moral credit to killers who suffer for what they do. Dexter suffers or performs suffering or at least narrates a great deal of inner conflict to us. And that conflict is a huge part of why we forgive him, why we keep rooting for him. Hannah denies us that comfort entirely. She killed, she had her reasons, and she carries no visible wound about it. She tends her flowers, she's at peace. And the show seems to understand that this is somehow more disturbing to us than the killing itself. We can handle a tormented murderer. A serene one unsettles something deeper. What I find so clever is that the show uses Hannah's serenity to expose the hollowness in Dexter's own torment. Because here's the thing he can never quite admit. Hannah is more honest than he is. She stopped lying to herself about what she is, and the result is a kind of calm that Dexter, for all his code and his rituals and his careful self-justifications, has never once managed to reach. He envies it. He's drawn to her not despite the absence of guilt, but because of it, because she represents the possibility of laying down a burden he's carried his whole life. And that possibility is the most dangerous thing anyone has ever offered him. Not partnership in killing, permission to stop hurting about it, to finally be at home in his own skin. The reason she sits on the seducer's level rather than somewhere higher is that her danger to Dexter is fundamentally relational. She's not hunting him. She's not a threat in the way a mob boss or a rival killer is a threat. The danger she poses is the danger of being wanted by someone who could pull you all the way into the dark and make it feel like home. She offers Dexter a future, a version of life where he doesn't have to lie, doesn't have to hide, doesn't have to carry the loneliness anymore. And the tragedy, the genuine tragedy of the later seasons is that some part of you watching almost wants him to take it. Almost. What links Miguel and Hannah and what defines this whole level is that the evil here works by appealing to Dexter's deepest unmet need. He is, underneath all the careful routine and the borrowed mannerisms, profoundly lonely. He spent his entire life believing he's the only one of his kind, separated from the rest of humanity by a wall he can never climb over. And the level 4 villains are the ones who showed up at that wall and said, "I'm on your side of it. Come here. You don't have to be alone." That's a far more dangerous offer than any knife. Because it doesn't threaten to end Dexter, it threatens to complete him on the wrong terms. And that's why I find this the most psychologically rich tier of the whole ladder. The people here aren't trying to destroy him, they're trying to keep him. And being kept, for a man who's never belonged anywhere, is the most seductive danger of all. Before we move on, this feels like a natural place to pause for just a moment. If you've been enjoying the slow wander through the show and you'd like more evenings like this one, subscribing genuinely helps. That's all, no hard sell, let's get back to it. Because so far, every villain we've met has been driven by something recognizably human. Damage, appetite, profit, loneliness, love. But the next level introduces a colder and stranger ingredient. What happens when a killer builds an entire belief system to justify what they do? What happens when the evil thinks it's holy? Let's talk about the true believers. I want to open this one with an image rather than an explanation, because the true believers of Dexter are best understood through the things they made. Picture a body arranged with terrible care. Not hidden, not disposed of, but staged, posed, surrounded by symbols, lit like a painting, composed like a scene from scripture brought horribly to life. There's a deliberateness to it that goes beyond murder. Somebody didn't just kill this person, somebody built something out of them with a message in mind, convinced the whole time that they were doing the work of something larger than themselves. That's the 6th season, that's the Doomsday Killer, and that's the territory we've climbed into now. The true believers are the killers who don't see themselves as killers at all. They've constructed an entire cosmology, a framework of meaning that reclassifies their atrocities as something noble or necessary or divinely ordained. And what makes them so frightening, more frightening to me than the mob or the manipulators, is that you cannot reason them out of it. A man who kills for money can be bought off. A man who kills because God told him to has no off switch you can reach. The belief is the engine, and the belief doesn't negotiate. Let's talk about Travis Marshall and Professor Geller, because their story is one of the strangest the show ever told, and the structure of it is worth walking through slowly. The 6th season gives us a series of these elaborate, horrifying religious tableaus, killings staged as enactments of imagery from the Book of Revelation. The 4 horsemen, the Whore of Babylon, scenes designed to herald the end of the world. And behind them, we're told, is a pairing. Travis Marshall, a younger man, a former student, and his mentor, Professor James Geller, a disgraced academic and religious zealot whose apocalyptic theories led his protege to believe that the two of them have been chosen to usher in the apocalypse. For most of the season, we watch this master and apprentice dynamic play out. Geller is the ideologue, the true believer in the purest sense, the one with the unshakable conviction. Travis is the follower, increasingly torn, occasionally showing flickers of doubt and even mercy. There's a moment where Travis is meant to mark a victim and instead shows compassion and lets her go. And you start to sense the cracks forming in him. He doesn't quite have the stomach for the full horror that Geller demands. And then comes the reveal, and it's a good one, so I'll let it land gently rather than dramatically. Geller is dead, has been dead in fact for a long time. Travis killed him, or Geller died, depending on how you read it, well before the events we've been watching. The Geller we've seen striding around issuing commands and dispensing apocalyptic theology exists only inside Travis's head. Travis has been doing all of it himself the whole time, while a hallucination of his mentor handed him permission. The body of the real Geller turns up in a freezer, and the entire architecture of the season reorganizes itself in your mind. I find this genuinely fascinating as a portrait of how a belief system can metastasize inside a single person. Travis couldn't bear the full weight of what he was doing, so he split it off. He invented an authority figure to carry the responsibility, a voice that could give the order so that Travis could merely follow them. It's the ultimate expression of the true believer's self-deception. Not only do they convince themselves that killing is holy, they invent a separate self to do the convincing. The belief becomes a character, a person who isn't there. And here's a detail I always find quietly devastating. We'll meet this exact mechanism again later tonight in a completely different context, when we talk about the voices Dexter himself carries around in his own head. Because Dexter too has a dead mentor who speaks to him and tells him what to do. Harry. The difference is that Harry's voice tends to pull Dexter toward restraint, toward the code, toward caution, whereas Geller's voice pulls Travis toward the abyss. But the underlying machinery is identical. A man so unable to own his own darkness that he externalizes it into a phantom advisor. The show is showing us, with Travis, a funhouse mirror version of Dexter's own psychology, which is exactly the kind of thing the series did when it was firing on all cylinders. Now let me cross a fairly large gap in the timeline and bring in another true believer, one who arrived years later in the revival because he belongs squarely on this level, even though he killed very differently. Kurt Caldwell, the runaway killer from New Blood. Kurt is, on the surface, the furthest thing from a religious fanatic. He's the unofficial mayor of a small town in upstate New York called Iron Lake. He's wealthy, generous, beloved, the sort of man who coaches kids and buys rounds and is woven into the fabric of the whole community. He went from driving trucks like his father did to owning the local truck stop and a fleet of his own. By every visible measure, he's a pillar of the place. And underneath all of it, for around 25 years, he's been hunting and killing young women, runaways mostly, the kind of vulnerable, transient people whose disappearances nobody investigates too hard. His method is grotesque in its own particular way. He lures these girls in with the offer of food and shelter, keeps them at a remote cabin, and then, after a while, tells them they're free to go and releases them into the woods. And as they run, he hunts them down and shoots them. He keeps trophies. He preserves the bodies. It's predatory in the most literal sense, a man treating human beings as game. But here's why Kurt belongs with the true believers rather than down on the predator levels, and it's all in how he understands himself. Kurt does not think he's a monster. Kurt thinks he's doing these girls a favor. In his own warped framework, he's saving them, rescuing them from a cruel world that would only chew them up and spit them out, sparing them a worse fate by giving them a clean ending on his terms. That's the belief he's built. That's the story he tells himself, and crucially, the story he seems to genuinely accept. When Dexter confronts him on this later, Dexter cuts straight through it, telling Kurt that he doesn't kill to save anyone, he kills because he likes being in control. And the friction between those two readings, Kurt's holy self-image and the ugly truth beneath it, is the whole character in miniature. What makes Kurt land so heavily, though, is the mirror he holds up to Dexter specifically. Because by the time of New Blood, Dexter is a father living under a false name, trying to do right by his son Harrison. And Kurt becomes, for a stretch, a kind of rival father figure to Harrison. Two men, both monsters, both wearing the mask of the respectable community member, both quietly competing for the soul of the same young man. Kurt is what Dexter could so easily be. A killer who's perfected the small-town disguise, who's beloved by everyone, who's gotten away with it for decades, and who has thoroughly convinced himself that his version of murder is somehow the merciful kind. The show is practically daring you to notice how little separates them. I want to linger on the texture of Travis's doubt for a moment because it's the most human thing on this whole tier, and the show handles it with real care. Travis is not a natural monster. That's the tragedy of him. He's a young man who fell under the influence of a powerful idea and a powerful personality, and somewhere inside him there's still a person who recoils from what he's being asked to do. We see it in those flickers of mercy, the moments where the human being in him surfaces and resists. He's not Geller. He doesn't have the bottomless conviction. He's a follower who got in far over his head and built an elaborate psychological structure to survive the weight of it. And I think that's why his story is sadder than it is frightening. He's less a villain who chose evil than a person who was hollowed out and filled with someone else's certainty, even when that someone was only ever a ghost he made himself. The mechanics of the hallucination reward a second look, too. When you go back and rewatch the season knowing the truth about Geller, the whole thing reorganizes in fascinating ways. All those scenes of the two of them together, Geller issuing commands, Travis deferring, take on a completely different character once you understand you've been watching one man the entire time, arguing with himself, giving himself orders, granting himself permission. It's a genuinely impressive bit of construction, and it's doing real thematic work rather than just being a clever twist for its own sake. It's a portrait of how a person fractures under the weight of their own actions, splitting off the part that gives the orders from the part that has to live with them. The belief didn't just justify the killing, it manufactured a whole second self to carry the blame. And I mentioned earlier that we'd meet this exact machinery again in Dexter himself, the dead mentor whispering in the ear. And I won't retread that ground here beyond noting how deliberately the season is in conversation with the rest of the show. Travis is a warning written in a language Dexter speaks fluently. Dexter just doesn't recognize himself in it, which is its own kind of telling. Let me add a little more about Kurt, because the more I sit with him, the more I think he's the most quietly disturbing villain of the entire revival era. And a great deal of that comes down to the mask. The thing about Kurt is how completely the disguise works, not just on the town, but you sense on himself. He genuinely seems to enjoy being beloved. He likes coaching, likes being generous, likes being the man everyone trusts. There's no indication that the warm public Kurt is purely a performance laid over a cold private one. The warmth seems real, which means the horror isn't that he's faking decency. The horror is that the decency and the predation coexist inside the same man without apparent friction. He can hunt a girl through the woods at night and run a kids team in the morning, and somehow, in his own mind, neither contaminates the other. That seamlessness is the most frightening thing about the true believers, and Kurt embodies it more thoroughly than anyone. He's built a story so complete that it lets him be two opposite things at once and feel like a unified, righteous whole. The girls aren't victims in his telling, they're souls he's rescuing from a worse fate. And because he believes it, the contradiction never costs him a single night's sleep. When Dexter strips that story away and names the real motive underneath, the simple, ugly desire for control, Kurt has no answer that survives contact with daylight. But Kurt doesn't need it to survive daylight. He only needs it to survive his own reflection, and at that, for 25 years, it worked perfectly. The rivalry over Harrison is what elevates Kurt from a strong villain into a genuinely meaningful one. Because the revival is, at its core, a story about fatherhood and inheritance, and Kurt drops into that story as a counterfeit father, a warm and welcoming presence offering Harrison exactly the acceptance and belonging that Dexter, with all his secrets and lies, struggles to provide. For a stretch, Harrison is drawn to him, and you can feel Dexter's dread at watching his son gravitate toward another monster. The competition isn't really about Harrison's company. It's about whose darkness, if any, the boy will inherit. Two killers, each one a possible future for the same young man. We'll come back to the inheritance question at the very top of the ladder, because it's the thread the whole series finally hangs on. For now, it's enough to notice that Kurt makes it concrete and personal in a way the show hadn't dared since Trinity. That, in the end, is the through line of the entire True Believer level. The most frightening evil isn't the evil that knows it's evil. The cartel soldier knows what he is. Lila, in her chaotic way, knows what she is. The true believers are something worse because they've talked themselves all the way around to the other side, and they sleep soundly at night convinced they're the good guys. Travis thought he was saving the world. Kurt thought he was saving those girls. Neither of them experienced a single night of the torment that Dexter, for all his careful self-mythology, at least had the decency to feel. And that brings us to a category that the show circled back to again and again, the one it found most haunting of all. Before we leave the true believers behind, though, there's a thought I want to leave hanging in the air, because it connects to the man at the center of all this. Dexter, too, is a kind of true believer. We touched on this when we talked about the ritual at the bottom of the ladder, the photographs, and the table, and the verdict being read. The whole apparatus of the code is, at heart, a belief system, a story Dexter tells himself about why his killing is different, cleaner, more justified than everyone else's. He believes he only takes the deserving. He believes the rules make him righteous. And the unsettling thing about spending an evening with Travis and Kurt is realizing how familiar that machinery is. They believed they were doing good too. Travis thought he was saving the world. Kurt thought he was saving those girls. Dexter thinks he's saving the future victims of the people he kills. The structure of the self-justification is identical. The only difference any of them can point to is that they happen to believe their own story is the true one, and every true believer believes that. It's what the word means. I don't raise this to drag Dexter down into the same pit as the Doomsday Killer, because the show does draw real distinctions, and I think those distinctions matter. But it's worth noticing that the line between Dexter and the true believers is thinner than he'd ever admit, and that the show put these particular villains in his path precisely so that thinness would show. They're not just monsters he hunts, they're arguments against the comfortable story he tells himself, which is, I think, the whole reason this level haunts the show as much as it does. Because the next level up isn't about belief, it's about something far more ordinary and far more chilling. It's about the monsters who built families, the killers who came home every night to people who loved them and never suspected a thing. Let's talk about the family men. If I had to name the single idea that Dexter cared about most across all its seasons and all its killers, it would be this one. The monster who hides inside a family, the man who tucks his children in at night and then goes out to do unspeakable things and comes home and tucks them in again the next night and is never once suspected. This was the show's deepest obsession, and it's the obsession that produced its greatest villain. So we're going to slow right down here and give this level the room it deserves, because everything the show was really about lives in this one tier. The man at the center of it is Arthur Mitchell, the Tri-Nighty Killer, and I think he's not just the best villain in Dexter, but one of the finest antagonists in the history of television, and I'll happily defend that. Let me lay out who Trinity is, because the scale of him matters. Arthur Mitchell has been killing for decades. Decades. He's not a recent monster, not someone who snapped one day and started a spree. He's been at this longer than almost anyone Dexter has ever encountered, killing in careful, repeating cycles, moving through a ritual pattern of victims so consistent that it took the authorities years even to realize the deaths were connected. He's the longest active killer in the entire series, and he's done it all while maintaining what looks, from the outside, like a completely ordinary suburban life. And that's the part that hooks Dexter, because Arthur Mitchell has a wife. He has children, he has a home, a job, a place in his community, a family that loves him. He is, on the surface, exactly the thing Dexter has spent his whole life believing he could never have. Dexter has always assumed that his nature and a real family were mutually exclusive, that the darkness inside him made genuine domestic happiness impossible. And then he meets a man who has been killing for 30 years and also has the family, the thing Dexter wants, the thing Dexter is told he can't have. Trinity seems to have figured out how to hold both. So Dexter does something he never does. He hesitates. He gets close to Trinity not to kill him, but to study him, to learn from him, to understand how this man pulled off the impossible trick of being a monster and a father at the same time. He inserts himself into Arthur's life, watches how he manages it, tries to absorb the secret. There's a genuine and genuinely misguided admiration there. Dexter looks at Trinity and sees a mentor, a model, proof that the life he longs for might actually be achievable. And this is the great, terrible irony of the fourth season, the thing that makes it the emotional summit of the whole series. Because the closer Dexter looks, the more the illusion falls apart. Arthur Mitchell does not have a happy family. Arthur Mitchell has a family living in quiet terror of him. Behind the closed doors of that ordinary suburban house, Arthur's a tyrant, a man whose loved ones flinch and walk on eggshells and have organized their entire inner lives around not setting him off. The family isn't proof that the monster can be tamed. The family is just another set of victims, ones who happen to still be breathing. The domesticity Dexter so admired was a performance laid over a slow, grinding cruelty. The show is making a devastating point here, and it makes it without ever quite spelling it out. Dexter wanted to believe that Trinity had reconciled the two halves of his life. What Trinity actually proves is that there is no reconciliation. You can wear the mask of the family man, but the family underneath the mask will pay for it every single day in ways large and small. The choice between the monster and the father isn't a choice you get to refuse. Trinity didn't solve the problem, he just hid the cost inside his own home, where no one outside could see it. I want to talk a little about the structure of Trinity's killing, because the patterns themselves tell you something about the man. His murders weren't random or opportunistic. They followed a fixed, repeating sequence, a cycle of distinct types of victim carried out in a particular order over and over across decades and across cities. The investigators who eventually pieced it together found a rhythm so consistent that it had hidden in plain sight for years, because nobody had connected deaths that looked on the surface like unrelated tragedies in unrelated places. That's the discipline of the man. Most killers are caught because they escalate, get sloppy, let the compulsion outrun the caution. Trinity never did. He'd found a pattern that satisfied whatever needed satisfying, and he repeated it with the patience of a man tending a garden, year after year, decade after decade, and it kept him invisible for an astonishingly long time. And there's a detail buried in that pattern that I find quietly horrifying, which is how much of it traces back to a single childhood tragedy in Trinity's own past. The cycle isn't arbitrary. Each type of killing in the sequence is, in its grim way, a reenactment, a compulsive return to an original wound that Arthur has been circling his entire adult life without ever resolving it. He's not killing for pleasure exactly, or for belief, or for profit. He's killing because something broke in him long ago, and the only relief he's ever found is in performing the same terrible ritual again and again. It connects him, uncomfortably, to Dexter, whose own darkness the show also traces to a single childhood horror. Two men shaped by an early trauma into compulsive repeaters. The difference, again, comes down to Harry and the code. Trinity had no one to channel the compulsion into anything but more victims. It's the same observation we keep arriving at from a new angle each time. Now back to the family, because the family is where Trinity does his most insidious work. The household runs on fear, but it's a specific kind of fear, the kind that doesn't always look like fear from the outside. The wife who's learned exactly how to keep the peace. The son who's absorbed the lesson that his father's moods are weather to be survived. The daughter navigating a home where love and terror have been braided together so tightly that the children can't fully separate them. From the street, it's a nice family in a nice house. Inside, every single person has organized their personality around the management of one dangerous man. And the thing that haunts me is that this is not exotic. Stripped of the serial killing, this is simply what life in a home with a frightening, controlling parent is like, and the show knows that and trusts us to recognize it. Trinity is a monster, yes. He's also just an abusive father turned up to a terrible volume. And that recognizability is what makes him land. When Dexter finally understands all this, that the family was never proof of anything except the family's own suffering, the admiration he'd built up curdles into something closer to horror at himself. He'd looked at this household and seen a model to aspire to. He'd wanted what Arthur had, and what Arthur actually had was a set of hostages who happened to share his last name. The fantasy Dexter had been nursing, that you could split the difference and have both the darkness and the love, collapses entirely in the face of what that house really contains. And then comes the price of Dexter's hesitation. And I want to handle this carefully because it's the heaviest moment in the entire series, and it doesn't need any sensationalizing from me, because Dexter waited, because he let Trinity live longer than the code would ever have allowed, choosing curiosity over caution, choosing the fantasy of the mentor over the safety of his own family. The cost came due in the worst imaginable way. By the time Dexter finally kills Arthur Mitchell, it's already too late. Trinity has reached back into Dexter's own life and taken the thing Dexter was trying to protect. Dexter comes home to find that his wife Rita is gone, killed in the manner Trinity reserved for a particular kind of victim, and their infant son left behind in the aftermath in a way that echoes, with awful precision, the very origin of Dexter's own darkness. The cycle Dexter was born from has repeated itself, one generation down, and it's Dexter's own delay that let it happen. I find this almost unbearably sad to talk about, and I think it's meant to be, because the show spent a whole season letting Dexter and us indulge the fantasy that you could have both, the darkness and the love, the killing and the family. And then it brought the entire fantasy crashing down in a single image, and it laid the blame, quietly but unmistakably, at Dexter's own feet. He didn't lose Rita to bad luck. He lost her because he wanted what Trinity had so badly that he stopped seeing Trinity clearly. The admiration was the weakness, the mirror got him. That's why Trinity sits where he does on this ladder. He's not just a great character or a frightening killer. He's the villain the entire show was building toward, thematically. Every earlier season had nibbled around the edges of the question, can a monster have a real life? And the fourth season finally answered it. And the answer was no, not really, not without someone paying. Arthur Mitchell is the embodiment of that no. And the fact that Dexter spent so long wanting to be him is the closest the series ever came to a tragedy in the old, proper sense of the word, where the hero's downfall comes directly from his own deepest desire. There's a question that the Family Man level raises and never fully closes, which is whether the double life is even possible to sustain without someone paying for it, and I think the honest answer the show keeps arriving at is no. Not really, not forever. Every family man on this tier is in effect running a debt. The respectable surface, the loving home, the trusted place in the community, all of it is borrowed against a darkness that has to go somewhere. And the show's grim accounting is that the darkness always, eventually, lands on the people closest to the man carrying it. Trinity's family lived inside his every day in small, invisible increments. Dexter's family paid in one catastrophic lump sum. But the principle is the same. You don't get to wear the mask for free. Somebody funds it, and it's never the man wearing it. I think this is why the Family Man villain disturbs us more than the obvious monster does. A killer who lives alone in the woods is frightening, but he's contained. His evil is at least confined to his victims. The Family Man brings the evil home, threads it through the most intimate relationships a person can have, and corrupts the very things, love and safety and belonging, that are supposed to be the antidote to evil. He poisons the well. And he does it while being, by every visible measure, a good husband, a good father, a good neighbor. That gap between the surface and the truth is the most unsettling thing the show ever traffics in, because it suggests that you genuinely cannot know what's behind any front door, including, the show quietly implies, your own. There's a smaller observation I want to add about the family man level, because Trinity isn't entirely alone in it, even if he dwarfs everyone else. The show kept returning to this template in different keys. We've already touched on Kurt Caldwell, who in the revival is essentially a Trinity for the New Blood era, the beloved community man with a quarter-century of bodies behind him. The two of them rhyme almost too neatly, two respectable pillars of their towns, two men who'd mastered the art of being exactly as visible and as trusted as they needed to be while doing the unthinkable in private. The difference is mostly that Kurt told himself a story about mercy, where Arthur didn't bother with stories at all. Arthur knew precisely what he was. He just kept it behind the front door. And then, of course, there's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of all of this, which the show absolutely intended us to feel. Dexter's a family man. Dexter's the monster behind the front door. By the later seasons, he has a son, he has a home, he has a carefully maintained surface of ordinary fatherhood draped over a killer's life. Everything that horrifies us about Trinity is, in slightly different proportions, true of the protagonist we've been rooting for the whole time. That's the genius and the cruelty of putting Trinity at this level. He's not just a villain Dexter faces, he's a prophecy, a look down the road at what the family man killer becomes when he keeps going long enough, and what it does to the people who love him. Dexter spent the 4th season trying to learn Trinity's secret. The secret, it turned out, was that there is no secret, only a bill that arrives eventually and is always paid by someone else. So that's the family men. The masters of the double life, the monsters in the suburbs, the fathers who are also predators. It's the level the whole show orbits, and it's the one I find hardest to shake, because there's no comfortable distance to put between these villains and the man we've been following. They are him and he is them, and the show never let us forget it, which leaves only the top of the ladder, the final level. And the people up here aren't strangers Dexter studied or killers he hunted across the city. Up here, the evil is closer than that. It's blood, it's origin. It's the people tied to Dexter not by circumstance, but by birth and by the very making of who he is. Let's climb the last step together slowly and talk about blood of his blood. Here we are at the top of the ladder. And I want to be honest about what makes this final level different from all the others. Everything below this point, however dark, however personal, was still in some sense external to Dexter. Trinity was a man he chose to study. Hannah was a woman he chose to love. Even the manipulators and the mob were people who entered his life from the outside. But up here, at level 7, the evil isn't something Dexter encountered. It's something he came from. These are the killers tied to him by blood and the people who quite literally helped build the monster he turned out to be. This is the most intimate evil the show has to offer, and there's a reason I've saved it for last. It's the level where the question stops being who is evil and becomes where did Dexter's evil come from in the first place? Let me start with the brother, Brian Moiser, the ice truck killer. Brian is the very first great villain of the series, the antagonist of that first season, and looking back across the whole run, I think he might also be the most important one, even if Trinity hits harder emotionally. Because Brian is the only person in the entire show who shares Dexter's exact origin. The two of them are biological brothers, and as children they witness the same unspeakable thing. The murder of their mother, the two small boys left sitting in the aftermath of it. That shared trauma is the seed of everything. It's the thing that, in the show's mythology, planted the darkness in both of them. The same wound, the same beginning, two boys who came out of the same horror and grew into two different monsters. The difference, and it's the whole tragedy of the first season, is what happened next. Dexter was found by Harry, taken in, raised, and given the code. That set of rules that channeled his darkness into something he could live with. Brian was not. Brian was left to grow up without any of that, without a Harry, without a code, without anyone to teach him how to carry what he was carrying. And so the two brothers became dark reflections of each other. Same starting point, wildly different paths, purely because one of them got found and the other one didn't. What makes Brian so devastating as a villain is that he's the only person who ever loved Dexter exactly as he truly is. Everyone else in Dexter's life loves a performance. Rita loves the boyfriend act. His colleagues love the cheerful donut-bringing blood guy. Even Deb, or his beloved sister, loves a brother who doesn't actually exist, a version of Dexter assembled from careful lies. But Brian sees through all of it because Brian is the same thing. When Brian looks at Dexter, he sees a killer and he loves him anyway. In fact, he loves him because of it. Brian's whole project in that first season is to free Dexter, to strip away the mask, dissolve the code, and invite his brother to join him in living openly as what they both are. And the price of admission, the thing Brian asks of Dexter to prove he's truly free, is that he kill Deb, his adoptive sister, the one genuine, uncomplicated love in Dexter's life. Brian lays it out almost tenderly. Deb is part of the lie, part of the false life Harry built, and to be truly himself, Dexter has to let her go. It's a horrifying ask, and it's also, in Brian's twisted logic, a loving one. He's offering his brother the only kind of intimacy he understands. Come and be a monster with me. Stop pretending. We're the same, you and I, and we don't have to be alone anymore. It's the same seduction we saw at level 4, the offer of not being alone, but it lands so much harder here because it comes from blood, from the one person with a genuine claim to understanding Dexter from the inside. And Dexter's choice, when it finally comes, defines him for the rest of the series. He chooses Deb. He chooses the constructed family over the biological one, the lie he loves over the truth that loves him. He kills his own brother to protect his sister, and he does it knowing that Brian was, in a strange and terrible way, the only one who ever truly saw him. That's the road not taken, made flesh, and then ended. Brian is the life Dexter could have had if Harry had never found him. And Dexter has to destroy that possibility with his own hands. I find it telling, and rather beautiful in a grim way, that Brian doesn't actually leave the show when he dies. He keeps coming back, years later, as a vision, a figure in Dexter's mind during moments when the dark passenger is pulling hardest. When Dexter's at his most untethered, it's Brian's face that appears to goad him toward embracing the darkness fully, which tells you everything about what Brian represents. He's not just a brother Dexter lost. He's the permanent voice of the path Dexter refused, always there, always whispering, "What if you just come with me?" Now let me bring in the second figure on this level, because the show eventually doubled down on this blood and origin theme in a way that pulls the whole series together. Ahliver Esaksun, or to use his real name, Daniel Vogel, the killer they called the brain surgeon from the final season. Saxon's story only makes sense alongside his mother, so let me introduce her too, because she's arguably the most important figure on this entire level, even though she never kills anyone with her own hands. Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who arrives in the final season and, in doing so, quietly rewrites the origin of the whole show. Because it turns out that the code, the famous code of Harry that has governed Dexter's entire adult life, wasn't really Harry's invention at all. The code of Harry was invented by Harry Morgan and Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel helped design it. She studied young psychopaths, Dexter among them, and she worked with Harry to shape the rules that would turn a dangerous boy into a controlled instrument. She refers to Dexter with genuine maternal warmth as her spiritual son. She didn't give birth to him, but in a very real sense, she helped give birth to the killer he became. And here's where it all clicks into a single dark shape. Vogel had a biological son, Daniel. And Daniel was, by her own account, a true psychopath from childhood. So dangerous that as a boy, he drowned his own younger brother, a death she and her husband covered up as an accident. Daniel was institutionalized and then was believed to have died in a fire at the facility as a teenager. But he didn't die. He survived, took on a new identity, and eventually resurfaced, decades later, as Oliver S. Aksun, the brain surgeon, a serial killer carving into the brains of his victims. So look at the symmetry the show is drawing for us. Vogel had two sons in a sense, a biological one and a spiritual one. Daniel, the real child, who she could not save, who became an uncontrolled monster, and Dexter, the project, the boy she helped shape with Harry, who became a controlled one. Saxon is the dark inverse of Dexter. Both of them are, in a way, Vogel's creations, two experiments in what becomes of a psychopath, one with the guiding hand and one without. It's the Brian dynamic all over again, found versus unfound, shaped versus unshaped, but this time with the architect of the shaping standing right there in the middle of it. There's a quality to the first season's mystery that I think gets lost when people remember Brian only as the twist at the end. For most of that season, we don't know who the ice truck killer is. We just know he's leaving Dexter these strange, almost playful messages, killing staged in ways that seem designed specifically to speak to Dexter, to provoke him, to draw him out. The bloodlessness of the crime scenes, the dismemberment, the theatrical presentation, all of it reads at first like taunting, like a rival killer showing off. And only gradually does it become clear that it was never taunting at all. It was courtship. Brian was trying to get his brother's attention the only way he knew how, leaving a trail of love letters written in the one language they both spoke fluently. When you rewatch the season with that understanding, the whole thing transforms from a cat and mouse game into something almost unbearably sad. A man trying to reach his lost brother and having no tools to do it with except the darkness they shared. The choice Dexter makes at the end of that season is, I'd argue, the foundational choice of the entire series, the one everything else is built on top of. He chooses the constructed family over the biological one. He chooses Deb, who loves a brother who doesn't exist, over Brian, who loves the brother who does. And he does it knowing exactly what he's giving up. It's not that Dexter fails to understand Brian's offer. He understands it completely, perhaps better than he understands anything Rita or his colleagues ever offer him. He simply decides that the lie is worth more to him than the truth, that the warmth of being loved for a fiction beats the cold of being loved for a fact. That's a remarkable thing for a show to put at the center of its hero. He chooses the comfortable lie with his eyes fully open and kills the one person who never asked him to pretend. And because the show is what it is, it never quite lets Brian stay dead. Years later, in moments when Dexter's grip on himself is slipping, it's Brian who returns as a vision to walk beside him and whisper encouragement toward the darkness. I find this one of the most psychologically astute touches in the whole series. Harry, the adoptive father, the architect of the code, appears to Dexter as the voice of restraint, the internalized parent saying, "No, careful, remember the rules." And Brian, the biological brother, appears as the voice of permission, the internalized sibling saying, "Yes, let go, be what you are." Two dead men, two voices, two fathers of a kind, pulling in opposite directions inside one haunted head. Dexter's entire inner life is a negotiation between the family that made him pretend and the family that wanted him to stop. It's beautifully done, and it means Brian never really leaves. He just moves inside. Let me give Vogel a little more room, because the more I think about her, the more central she becomes to this whole final level, and to the show's deepest question. The reveal that she co-authored the code retroactively reframes everything we thought we knew about Dexter's origin. For seasons, we understood Harry as the lone source, the cop father who discovered his son's nature and built a set of rules to contain it out of paternal love. And then Vogel arrives and complicates that clean story enormously. The code wasn't just a father's desperate improvisation. It was, in part, a clinician's design, the product of a woman who studied young psychopaths with scientific fascination and saw in Dexter a particularly promising subject. That word, subject, is the uncomfortable one, because it means that somewhere underneath the love Harry felt, there was also an experiment being run, and Dexter was the experiment. The symmetry the show builds between her two sons is almost too neat, and yet it works. Daniel, the biological child, the one she couldn't reach, who killed his own brother as a boy and grew into an uncontrolled monster. And Dexter, the spiritual child, the one she helped shape, who became a controlled one. Same raw material, the dangerous wiring of a psychopath. Two utterly different outcomes, and the variable that separates them is intervention, guidance, the presence or absence of a shaping hand at the crucial moment. It's the Brian dynamic restated at the level of the entire series, found versus unfound, and this time the show puts the person responsible for the finding right there on screen, forcing us to ask what she really did and whether it was love or hubris or some inseparable tangle of both. And Saxon, her real son, becomes the dark proof of what Dexter might have been. Where Dexter channels his compulsion through the code into targets the show wants us to accept, Saxon channels nothing. He simply takes what he wants, carves into the brains of his victims, a man with all of Dexter's wiring and none of Dexter's restraints. He's the control group, in a sense, the version of the experiment with the intervention removed. And the show drives the point home with brutal finality by making him the one who, in the end, is responsible for taking Deb away from Dexter for good. The sister Dexter once killed his own brother to protect is, in the end, lost anyway, and Saxon's hand is in it. There's a horrible closing of the circle there. The Blood and Origin level opened with Dexter sacrificing his brother to save Deb, and it closes with another of these origin-linked monsters being the one who finally takes her. As if the show were saying that Dexter could run from his origins all he liked, but the darkness he came from would always eventually reach the people he loved. That question, whether the act of making a monster is itself a kind of evil, is the one I find most haunting about this whole level, and Vogel sits right at the heart of it. She's not a killer. By the standards of every other tier on this ladder, she's barely a villain at all. And yet she took children, studied their darkness, and built systems to direct it, and you can't entirely separate her clinical fascination from the harm that flowed out of it. She made the code that lets Dexter tell himself he's righteous. She failed her own son so completely that he became a brain-collecting murderer. Is that evil? Or is it just the cold, well-meaning hubris of someone who believes she could engineer the human soul? The show doesn't answer cleanly, and I think that's right. Some evils don't come from cruelty. They come from people who thought they were doing science or doing good and never quite reckoned with what they were really building. I find Vogel genuinely unsettling in a way none of the actual killers manage, and I've thought a fair bit about why. I think it's because she represents a kind of evil that doesn't feel like evil from the inside, and probably never did, not even for a moment. The killers all have something visceral about them, some appetite or compulsion or rage you can at least point to and name. Vogel has only curiosity, a bright, clinical, bottomless curiosity about how the dangerous mind works and whether it can be steered. And curiosity, we tend to think, is a virtue. It's what we praise in scientists and scholars. But Vogel is the reminder that curiosity pointed at the wrong question and pursued without enough care about the human cost can do as much damage as any blade. She didn't want to hurt anyone innocent. She wanted to understand. And in the wanting, she helped make two monsters, one she lost and one she shaped, and never seems to have fully grasped that the making was on her hands either way. She calls Dexter her spiritual son, with what seems like genuine warmth, and she means it. She loves the thing she helped build. She just never quite sees that helping to build it might have been the most monstrous thing anyone in this entire gallery ever did. And that leads me to the gentlest and most open-ended thread on this entire level, which I want to touch on lightly, because the show itself leaves it deliberately unresolved. Harrison, Dexter's son, because if the great theme of level 7 is that evil runs in the blood, that it passes from parent to child, from origin to inheritor, then the obvious and frightening question is, what about the boy? Harrison carries Dexter's blood. He was there as an infant, in the aftermath of his mother's death, sitting in the blood just as Dexter once sat in his own mother's. The same seed, the same beginning. The show told us planted the darkness in Dexter and Brian both. The revival series sit with this question rather than answering it. Is Harrison fated to become what his father is? Is the darkness inherited or learned or neither? Can the cycle be broken, or does it simply repeat one more generation down? I don't want to spoil the turns the revival takes for anyone still working through them. And honestly, the show keeps the matter open on purpose because it's the question the entire series has been circling from the very first episode. What I find genuinely thoughtful about how the revival handles Harrison is that it refuses the easy version of the story in either direction. It would have been simple to make him a clean inheritor, a little Dexter in waiting, the darkness passing intact from father to son like a family curse, and it would have been equally simple and equally cheap to make him entirely untouched, a normal boy who proves the darkness was never really heritable at all. The show does neither. It gives us a young man who is clearly shaped by something, who carries anger and confusion and a capacity that frightens even him, but who is also a person making choices, not a fate unfolding on rails. He's neither doomed nor safe. He's a kid trying to work out what he is with a father whose example is the worst possible guide and the only one available. And that, I think, is the most honest thing the show could have done with the inheritance question, because it mirrors how these things actually work in real families. Children of difficult parents aren't simply doomed to repeat them, and they're not simply free of them either. They carry something forward, some wiring or some wound or some learned way of moving through the world, and then they spend their lives deciding what to do with it. The nature versus nurture argument has never had a tidy winner, in fiction or in life, and Harrison is the show's way of refusing to pretend otherwise. He's the open question the whole series was always going to end on, because it's the question it began with. Two brothers from the same horror grew two different ways. Now there's a third planting, and the show has the good sense to let us wonder rather than telling us. So that's the top of the ladder. Blood of his blood. The brother who was the road not taken. The dark twin who was the experiment that went wrong. The woman who engineered the soul of a killer. And the son who carries the seed forward into a future the show won't let us see. This is the most personal evil in all of Dexter because it isn't really about evil people at all in the end. It's about where evil comes from and whether anyone ever really chooses it or whether it's just handed down parent to child like an heirloom nobody asked for. And on that thought, I think it's time to step back from the ladder altogether and ask the bigger question that's been quietly waiting underneath this whole climb. Why did this show care so much about sorting its monsters in the first place? Let's wind down with that. So we've climbed the whole ladder now, all 7 rungs of it, from the small and pathetic cruelty at the bottom to the blood-deep inherited darkness at the top. And before we say goodnight, I want to sit for a little while with the question that's been quietly humming underneath this entire evening. Why? Why did a show about a serial killer spend so much of its energy carefully distinguishing between kinds of evil? It would have been so much easier to just have monsters, generic, interchangeable bad guys for the hero to dispatch one season at a time. Plenty of shows do exactly that, and nobody complains. So why did Dexter bother building this whole elaborate spectrum, this taxonomy, this ladder? I think the answer is that the show wasn't really making a list of villains at all. I think it was making a list of mirrors. Every single level we've talked about tonight is, at bottom, a different answer to the same question, which is the only question the show ever truly cared about. What is Dexter? Where does he fall on this ladder? Is he the petty cruelty at the bottom, or the cold machine, or the lonely seeker of partnership, or the true believer convinced of his own righteousness, or the family man hiding the costs behind a front door, or the inheritor of a darkness he never chose? And the uncomfortable, brilliant truth is that he's a little bit of all of them. Every villain was a piece of Dexter held up to the light and examined on its own. Think about that for a second. The manipulators showed us his capacity for performance, the way he works on the people around him to keep his cover intact. The mob showed us his detachment, his ability to kill without it touching the part of him that loves his sister and his son. The seducers showed us his loneliness, that aching need to be understood that he could never quite satisfy. The true believers showed us the danger of his own self-mythology, the stories he tells himself about the code making him noble. The family men showed us the impossible double life he was trying to live and the bill that always comes due. And the blood of his blood showed us where the whole thing started and asked whether he ever really had a choice at all. The villains weren't obstacles. They were a diagnosis delivered one season at a time. And this is what I find genuinely moving about the show, underneath all the blood and the dark comedy and the gloriously incompetent police department. Dexter is, at its heart, a long and serious meditation on a question most of us would rather not think about too hard. Is a person the sum of what they do, or is there something underneath the actions, some essential self that the actions don't quite reach? The show kept introducing killers who'd answered that question in different ways. Some embraced what they were, some lied to themselves about it, some never had the chance to become anything else. And Dexter, our Dexter, spent every season caught in the middle of all of them, unable to decide, unable to stop, unable to be fully the monster or fully the man. I don't think the show ever gave us a tidy verdict, and I've made my peace with that. I used to want it to. I used to want some final scene that told me definitively whether Dexter was a good man cursed with terrible urges or a terrible man telling himself a comforting story. But I've come to think the refusal to answer is the honest part, because real people are like that too. We don't get a final scene that tells us what we really were. We just get the long middle, the daily choices, the mirrors we look into, and the things we decide not to see. The ladder of evil in Dexter isn't really about the villains. It's about the fact that we're all standing somewhere on it, most of us near the bottom, thank goodness, but on it all the same, and none of us entirely sure how far up the next choice might carry us. There's a small detail I keep returning to now that we're at the end, and it's the thing about the voices. Travis had Geller, Dexter had Harry, and later Brian. The dead mentors who walk beside the living and tell them what to do. I mentioned earlier that the machinery is identical even when the message points in opposite directions, one toward restraint and one toward the abyss. And I think that's maybe the closest the show ever came to its own thesis. We're all being whispered to by the people who made us, the voices of our parents, our teachers, the dead we carry around. The only real freedom any of us has is in deciding which voice to listen to. And even that freedom is smaller than we'd like to believe. Dexter listened to Harry mostly, and it made him a controlled monster instead of an uncontrolled one. That's the whole difference between him and his brother. A voice, a guiding hand that arrived in time. It's a thin thread to hang a soul on, and the show knew it. I want to sit for a moment with the idea of the ladder itself because I think there's a reason it ended up shaped the way it did, climbing from the impersonal toward the intimate. Notice that the further up we went tonight, the closer the evil got to Dexter personally. At the bottom were strangers, the disposable cruelties of the world, people he'd never met and would never think about again. And at the top were his brother, his maker's son, his own child. The show structured its entire moral universe so that the worst evil, the most haunting evil, was also the closest evil. the evil of blood and origin and home. And I don't think that's an accident. I think the show was telling us gently and across many years that the darkness that matters most is never the darkness out there in the world. It's the darkness you're related to, the darkness you came from, the darkness sitting across the dinner table. That's a deeply uncomfortable thought, and it's also, I suspect, a true one. The strangers we fear are mostly not the ones who hurt us. The people who hurt us are almost always the people who were close enough to do it. The ones who had access, who had our trust, who shared our name or our bed or our blood. Dexter dressed that ordinary truth up in plastic wrap and blood slides and a serial killer's rituals. But underneath all the genre machinery, it was saying something quite plain about how harm actually moves through a human life. It moves along the lines of intimacy. It travels down the bloodline. It comes home. And the show's whole ascending ladder of villains was really just a long, patient way of walking us toward that single, quiet, devastating idea. So if you're still awake, and I hope the climb was a comfortable one, whether you made it all the way or drifted off somewhere around the mob, I'll leave you with this. The reason Dexter could sort its monsters so carefully is that it took evil seriously as a subject, not as a spectacle. It believed that the difference between kinds of darkness actually mattered, that a man who kills out of inherited compulsion is a different creature from a man who kills for profit or belief or love. And in taking that seriously, it ended up taking people seriously, even the worst of them. There's a strange generosity in that. A show willing to look at a brain-collecting murderer or a quarter-century predator and ask patiently, all right, but what kind of darkness is this one and where did it come from? That's not the work of a show that hates its monsters. That's the work of a show that wanted to understand them, which is, in the end, a far more interesting thing to do. I've got a few ideas for where we might go on future evenings if you'd like to keep these going. I'd genuinely love to do an evening just on the victims, the people who ended up on Dexter's table, the deserving and the not so deserving, and what the show's choices about who lived and who died tell us about its own conscience. I'd also like to spend a whole night on the people who very nearly caught Dexter over the years, the Dokes and the Lundys, the ones who felt something was wrong long before they could prove it, because that's a whole rich theme of its own. And one of these nights, I want to just sit with the code itself, where it came from, what it really was, and whether it ever made Dexter better or just made him feel better. Plenty of ladders left to climb, in other words. But that's all for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever hour it's found you, I'm grateful for the company, as always. We've spent the evening in the dark among some genuinely terrible people, and yet I hope it felt like what it was meant to be, which is a calm and quiet wander rather than anything that's going to keep you up. The monsters are all back in their boxes now. The ladder can wait until next time. The dark passenger can rest, and so can you. Sleep well, and I'll see you on the next evening together. Good night.